In the rolling hills and sun-drenched vineyards of southern France, a child was born in 1122 who would one day become one of the most extraordinary women of the Middle Ages. Eleanor of Aquitaine, daughter of William X, Duke of Aquitaine, entered a world where women of noble birth were usually pawns in dynastic games. Yet Eleanor's story would be anything but typical. From an early age, she was marked for greatness, not merely because of her birth, but because of the vast inheritance that awaited her. Aquitaine, her ancestral land, was one of the richest and most culturally sophisticated regions in medieval Europe. Stretching from the Loire Valley down to the Pyrenees, it was larger than the Kingdom of France itself. The court of Aquitaine was unlike the dark northern courts, filled with music, troubadours, poetry, and a culture of chivalry that celebrated refinement and wit. Eleanor grew up immersed in this atmosphere of brilliance, absorbing ideas about politics, art, and personal freedom that would shape her worldview. When her father, Duke William, died suddenly in 1137, Eleanor inherited the duchy at the tender age of 15. Overnight, she became the most sought-after bride in Europe. Her lands made her one of the wealthiest women alive, and with wealth came influence. But in the volatile politics of medieval Europe, wealth was also dangerous. Almost immediately, she was placed under the guardianship of the King of France, who wasted no time arranging her marriage to his son, the young Louis VII. The union would bind Aquitaine to the French crown, or so the king thought. Eleanor and Louis married that same year, and only days later, fate shifted again. Louis's father died suddenly, elevating the teenage pair, the king and queen of France. In the space of a few months, Eleanor had gone from duchess to queen, her destiny forever tied to the shifting tides of European politics. Yet Louis was not her equal in either spirit or ambition. Devout, timid, and more inclined to prayer than governance, Louis was the opposite of Eleanor, vibrant, headstrong, and unafraid of power. Their marriage would soon reveal itself as a clash of personalities destined for conflict. But Eleanor's influence as queen could not be ignored. She brought Aquitaine's courtly culture with her to Paris, transforming the staid French court into a hub of song, poetry, and intellectual exchange. Troubadours sang of love and valor in her halls, and whispers spread that the Queen of France herself might be the inspiration for these tales. She was admired, envied, and sometimes feared. For Eleanor, queenship was not a passive role. She was not content to sit silently beside her husband. She intended to rule. Yet this was only the beginning of her journey. From heiress to Queen of France, and later, Queen of England, Eleanor of Aquitaine would not only outlive two husbands, but also outmaneuver kings, command armies, and leave a legacy that defied every expectation of medieval womanhood. The marriage between Eleanor of Aquitaine and Louis VII of France began with grandeur, but it quickly revealed cracks. Louis, deeply religious and hesitant in worldly affairs, struggled to understand his wife's fiery nature. Eleanor, raised in a court that celebrated wit and passion, found herself confined in a kingdom where piety often smothered pleasure. Yet in 1147, an event arose that would test their partnership in an extraordinary way: the Second Crusade. When Pope Eugenius III called for Christian rulers to march east in defense of Jerusalem, Louis eagerly embraced cause. Eleanor, never one to fade into the background, insisted on joining him. Unlike most medieval queens, she did not remain at home to rule in her husband's absence. Instead, Eleanor rallied her vassals and led her own soldiers to the Holy Land. Chroniclers marveled at the sight of the queen, armored and commanding, riding at the head of her Aquitanian knights. She was not merely a royal consort, but a leader in her own right. The journey, however, proved disastrous. Poor planning, disease, and constant skirmishes weakened the French forces. Eleanor's presence, though inspiring to some, scandalized others. The sight of women on crusade, noble ladies riding alongside their men, shocked conservative minds. Rumors spread that Eleanor and her ladies dressed as Amazons, blurring the lines between traditional gender roles. Even worse, whispers circulated that Eleanor grew too close to her uncle, Raymond of Poitiers, Prince of Antioch. Chroniclers, often hostile toward powerful women, twisted her political discussions into suggestions of an improper relationship. At Antioch, Eleanor urged Louis to redirect their military efforts toward securing the Principality of Antioch. which was strategically vital. Louis, however, rejected her advice and insisted on continuing toward Jerusalem. The disagreement grew bitter, and Louis accused her of disloyalty. By the time the Crusade limped home in failure, their marriage was strained to the breaking point. Back in France, Eleanor's influence waned as Louis and his advisors grew wary of her independence. She had produced only daughters, no male heir, and this too cast a shadow over their union. In the patriarchal politics of medieval Europe, queens were often valued primarily for their ability to provide sons. Eleanor's intellect, ambition, and boldness, rather than being celebrated, became ammunition for critics who whispered that she was dangerous, even unnatural. Finally, in 1152, after 15 tumultuous years of marriage, the union was annulled. The official reason given was consanguinity, that they were too closely related by blood, a common loophole for failed royal marriages. But the truth was plain. Eleanor and Louis were utterly incompatible. She had been a queen of France, but never a submissive one. Louis sought piety and obedience. Eleanor demanded power and partnership. For most women of her time, a failed marriage to a king would have spelled the end of political relevance. But Eleanor of Aquitaine was no ordinary woman. Within weeks of her annulment, she shocked Europe again by remarrying not just another nobleman, but the man who would become one of the greatest kings in English history. Eleanor's second marriage would transform her from Queen of France into Queen of England and plunge her into a world of even greater conflict and power. When Eleanor's marriage to Louis VII ended in 1152, many assumed she would retire quietly to her duchy. Instead, she displayed the political acumen and boldness that had already set her apart. Returning to her beloved Aquitaine, Eleanor barely had time to breathe before she made a move that stunned all of Europe. Only weeks after her annulment, she married Henry Plantagenet, the young and ambitious Duke of Normandy. This marriage was not merely a union of hearts, but a calculated alliance of immense consequence. Henry, fiery and restless, was already laying claim to the English throne through his mother, Matilda. By wedding Eleanor, he gained control of her vast Aquitanian lands, uniting them with his own territories in Normandy and Anjou. Together, their holdings stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees, forming what historians would later call the Angevin Empire. The speed of Eleanor's remarriage scandalized her contemporaries. Some accused her of adultery, suggesting she had plotted the match even before her annulment. Others whispered that Henry, 11 years her junior, had been bewitched by her charm. But whatever the gossip, the reality was simple. Eleanor had secured her survival and enhanced her power by choosing a husband destined for greatness. In 1154, Henry's destiny was realized. When King Stephen of England died, Henry ascended the throne as Henry II, making Eleanor Queen of England. Once again, Eleanor found herself crowned queen, this time of a far more turbulent and powerful kingdom. Unlike Louis, Henry was no timid monk. He was energetic, passionate, and relentless, a man whose drive matched Eleanor's own. For a time, they seemed the perfect pair, bound by ambition and shared authority. As queen, Eleanor wielded enormous influence. Not only did she govern her duchy of Aquitaine independently, but she also acted as Henry's partner in rule. Together they presided over one of the most extensive realms in Europe. Chroniclers noted her sharp intelligence, her ability to mediate disputes, and her skill in administration. She bore Henry 8 children, 5 sons and 3 daughters, securing the dynasty's future. Among them were Richard the Lionheart and John, names destined to shape English history. Yet their union, though powerful, was also volatile. Henry's temper was legendary, and his numerous infidelities strained a marriage. Eleanor, never content to remain silent, clashed with him repeatedly, but for a time the balance held. They were rulers, allies, and rivals all at once. Eleanor's role as Queen of England cemented her as one of the most influential women of her age. She had already worn 2 crowns, shaped 2 kingdoms, and birthed a dynasty that would dominate Europe. But the years ahead would test her in ways even she could not have foreseen. From political rebellions to imprisonment, Eleanor's life was far from settled. Her story was only growing more dramatic. By the mid-12th century, Eleanor of Aquitaine had secured her position not only as queen, but as a matriarch of a dynasty that would dominate European politics for generations. With Henry II, she bore 8 children, a remarkable legacy for any medieval queen. These were not merely royal offspring. They were figures who would become legends in their own right. Richard the Lionheart, John Lackland, Geoffrey of Brittany, Henry the Young King, and her formidable daughters Matilda, Eleanor, and Joan. Eleanor's household was no ordinary nursery. She raised her children with an eye toward ambition and influence. Each child was not just a son or daughter, but a potential ruler, pawn, or partner in the dynastic chess game of Europe. Eleanor's daughters, married into powerful courts across the continent, carried her influence far beyond England and Aquitaine. Her sons, meanwhile, were bred to inherit vast territories and wield unimaginable power. But Eleanor's role as mother was not confined to the private sphere. She actively shaped her children's futures, arranging marriages, advising them in political disputes, and instilling in them the fierce independence that defined her own life. Chroniclers often accuse her of favoritism, particularly toward Richard, whose charisma and martial prowess reminded many of Eleanor herself. But the truth was that she sought to strengthen all her children in a world where dynasties often rose and fell within a single generation. Yet motherhood in the Angevin Empire was fraught with peril. Henry II's restless ambition and harsh rule created constant tension. His tendency to sideline Eleanor, especially as he grew more enamored of his mistresses, fractured their partnership. By the 1170s, cracks had widened into chasms. Eleanor's sons, resentful of their father's dominance, began to see her as an ally in their struggle for power. This was no small matter. To oppose Henry II was to oppose one of the most formidable monarchs in Europe. Yet Eleanor, ever bold, did not shrink from challenge. For her, loyalty to her sons outweighed loyalty to her husband. She had brought the Plantagenet dynasty into being. Now she would fight to ensure her children inherited it. Her maternal role, then, was inseparable from her political one. She was not content to merely watch her sons grow into men. She positioned herself as their advisor, protector, and when necessary, co-conspirator. This blending of motherhood and power was unprecedented. Medieval queens were expected to be dutiful wives and nurturing mothers. Eleanor shattered that mold. She was both, and she was also a political operator whose ambitions rivaled any king's. The seeds of rebellion were already sprouting. Eleanor's sons, encouraged by their mother, would soon rise against their father in one of the most dramatic familial conflicts of the Middle Ages. For Eleanor, this rebellion would test the limits of her power, her loyalty, and her very survival. In 1173, a storm erupted within the Angevin Empire, and Eleanor of Aquitaine stood at its heart. Her sons, Henry the Young King, Richard, and Geoffrey, rose in rebellion against their father, King Henry II. The causes were many: resentment over lands withheld, jealousy between siblings, and fury at their father's iron control. But behind the scenes, Eleanor played a decisive role. No longer content to endure her husband's dominance, Eleanor encouraged her sons to assert their rights. For her, the rebellion was personal as well as political. Henry's infidelities and dismissive treatment had soured their marriage beyond repair. Supporting her sons was both an act of maternal loyalty and a declaration of independence from the king who had long overshadowed her. The revolt quickly spread across Henry's empire, drawing in foreign allies and threatening the very stability of his rule. Eleanor coordinated with her sons, lending them not only her counsel but her prestige as Duchess of Aquitaine. To the lords of southern France, she remained their sovereign, and her voice carried weight. Chroniclers later painted her as a scheming instigator, a mother who turned her children against their father. Whether or not she was a rebellion's mastermind, Eleanor's involvement was undeniable. But the gamble failed. Henry II, ruthless and efficient, crushed the rebellion with characteristic vigor. His sons were forced into submission, their ambitions temporarily thwarted. Eleanor, however, paid the heaviest price. Captured by Henry's forces, she was accused of treachery and rebellion. For a queen to plot against her king was shocking. For a wife to conspire against her husband was nearly unthinkable. Henry's response was swift and merciless. In 1174, Eleanor was imprisoned, effectively removed from power. For the next 16 years, she lived in captivity, sometimes confined in castles, sometimes under close supervision, but always under Henry's watchful eye. She was permitted limited freedom, occasionally brought to court for appearances, but she remained a prisoner of the husband she had once partnered in empire. The world may have thought Eleanor broken, but she endured. Even in confinement, she remained a symbol of defiance. Her sons continued to see her as their champion, writing to her, seeking her approval, and dreaming of the day they might secure her release. Eleanor's absence from the political stage was profound, yet her influence lingered. The queen who had ruled 2 kingdoms and commanded armies now lived behind stone walls. But Eleanor of Aquitaine was not finished. The wheel of fortune would turn again, and when it did, she would emerge from imprisonment to reclaim her role as one of the most powerful women in Europe. In 1189, fate shifted dramatically. King Henry II lay dying, defeated not by armies but by age, betrayal, and exhaustion. His sons had turned against him once again, and this time Richard, Eleanor's favorite, emerged as the heir. As Henry's power crumbled, he ordered Eleanor released from captivity. After 16 long years, she was free. Her return to the world was nothing short of triumphant. At 67 years old, Eleanor could have retreated into retirement. Instead, she stepped back onto the stage with renewed vigor. Richard the Lionheart, crowned King of England in 1189, owed much of his success to her. Eleanor was not only his mother, but his most trusted advisor. Richard, ever the warrior, spent much of his reign abroad on Crusade. This left England vulnerable, but Eleanor filled the void. Acting as regent in his absence, she governed the kingdom with authority and wisdom. From her court at Winchester, she issued orders, settled disputes, and kept the realm steady while her son chased glory in the Holy Land. Chroniclers marveled at her resilience. She was not merely a caretaker queen. She was the backbone of Richard's rule. Her influence extended beyond England. Eleanor negotiated alliances, arranged marriages, and even traveled across Europe in her old age to secure her dynasty's power. Most famously, she played a crucial role in securing Richard's release when he was captured and held for ransom by the Holy Roman Emperor. The elderly queen raised an enormous sum demanded for his freedom, rallying her subjects and managing the kingdom's resources with astonishing skill. But Eleanor's devotion to Richard was not blind. She counseled him with frankness, warning against reckless actions and reminding him of his responsibilities as king. Their bond was one of mutual respect, rare in the annals of medieval monarchy. Richard trusted her judgment as much as he trusted his own sword. During this period, Eleanor's legacy as the matriarch of the Plantagenet dynasty became fully clear. She was not only the mother of a king, but the mother of a legend. Richard's exploits as crusader and warrior earned him eternal fame, but without Eleanor's steadfast rule at home, his kingdom might well have collapsed in his absence. The world that had once confined her to prison now bowed again to her authority. Eleanor had endured humiliation in captivity, but she had emerged stronger, wiser, and more indispensable than ever. Her story was no longer one of rebellion or scandal. It was one of endurance, resilience, and unmatched political skill. By the time Richard the Lionheart secured his throne, Eleanor of Aquitaine was already in her 70s, an age few medieval women lived to see. Yet far from fading into obscurity, Eleanor remained as active and influential as ever. Age, for her, was not a limitation but a testament to survival. In an era when women were often discarded once they had outlived their childbearing years, Eleanor defied convention. She continued to travel across Europe, negotiating marriages for her grandchildren and maintaining diplomatic networks that stretched from Castile to Sicily. Her wisdom and experience made her an invaluable advisor, not just to Richard but to other rulers who sought her counsel. One of her most remarkable journeys came in 1200, when she was nearly 80. Despite her advanced age, Eleanor crossed the Pyrenees to escort her granddaughter Blanche of Castile to France, where she was to marry the future Louis VIII. The journey was grueling, but Eleanor endured it with characteristic determination. Blanche would later become the mother of St. Louis, King of France, extending Eleanor's legacy even further into European history. Her resilience amazed contemporaries. Chroniclers often marveled at her energy, describing her as indefatigable. She had outlived 2 kings, seen her children crowned and buried, and remained at the heart of dynastic politics for more than 6 decades. Few monarchs of her era, male or female, wielded such sustained influence. But Eleanor's later years were also marked by sorrow. In 1199, her beloved Richard was fatally wounded in battle. His death was a crushing blow, yet Eleanor did not collapse under grief. Instead, she turned her attention to her youngest surviving son, John, who now inherited the throne. John would prove to be a far less capable ruler, earning the scorn of his subjects and the hatred of history. Yet even John leaned on his mother's advice, for her authority remained unmatched. Eleanor's twilight years were spent largely at the Abbey of Fontevraud, a place of retreat where many Plantagenets were buried. Yet even here, she did not live in quiet seclusion. Envoys came to consult her, and she remained a figure of respect and awe. To the younger generation, she was a living legend, a woman who had been queen of both France and England, mother of kings, and a political force unlike any other. By sheer endurance, Eleanor had carved out a role that transcended the boundaries of her gender and her time. She was not just a queen, but the embodiment of dynastic survival, resilience, and adaptability. In her final years, she stood as a symbol of continuity in a world of shifting power. While Eleanor's political career was remarkable, her cultural legacy was equally profound. She grew up in the refined courts of Aquitaine, where troubadours celebrated ideals of chivalry, romance, and courtly love. This atmosphere shaped her deeply, and throughout her life, she carried that cultural spirit with her, transforming the court she entered. When she became Queen of France, Eleanor introduced the lyrical traditions of Aquitaine to a more austere northern court. Troubadours followed in her train, bringing with them songs of love and valor. Later, as Queen of England, she continued to cultivate this cultural richness, turning her court into a hub of artistry and intellectual exchange. Eleanor is often credited with fostering the tradition of courtly love that would define medieval literature for centuries. Stories of knights who served noble ladies with devotion, poems that elevated romantic passion into an art form. All these found fertile ground under her patronage. Some even suggest that Eleanor and her daughter, Marie of Champagne, presided over so-called courts of love, gatherings where noble women debated questions of romance and honor. Though historians debate the literal truth of these courts, there is no doubt that Eleanor's influence helped shape the cultural flowering of the 12th century. Writers such as Chrétien de Troyes, who crafted the earliest tales of Lancelot and Guinevere, thrived in this environment. The legends of King Arthur, which continue to enchant audiences today, owe much of their development to the cultural world Eleanor nurtured. Eleanor's patronage of the arts was not frivolous but political. By fostering ideals of chivalry and honor, she reinforced the values that underpinned her dynasty. Knights inspired by tales of noble love were also knights inspired to serve their lords with loyalty and valor. Culture became a tool of governance, binding society together through shared ideals. For Eleanor herself, these traditions offered a language through which her own life could be understood. She was often cast in a role of the powerful lady, inspiring devotion and commanding respect. Chroniclers who disapproved of her independence painted her as manipulative or scandalous, but the poets saw something else, a woman who embodied the noblest ideals of her age. Her cultural legacy extended beyond her lifetime. The ideals of courtly love, the flowering of Arthurian legend, and the romantic image of medieval knighthood all carried traces of Eleanor's influence. She was not only a queen of politics, but a queen of culture, shaping the way an entire civilization imagined itself. In this, as in everything else, Eleanor transcended the limits of her role. She was not simply a participant in history. She was a creator of it, weaving politics and poetry together into a legacy that endures to this day. As the 13th century dawned, Eleanor of Aquitaine approached the end of her extraordinary life. Having lived nearly 8 decades, a remarkable span in a time when few reached old age, she had seen more triumph and tragedy than most monarchs could imagine. Her later years were spent primarily at the Abbey of Fontevraud, the resting place of the Plantagenet dynasty. Here, surrounded by the quiet rhythms of monastic life, Eleanor found a measure of peace. Yet even in her final decade, she was called upon to act. In 1200, she undertook the arduous journey to Spain to escort her granddaughter Blanche to France, securing a marriage alliance that would strengthen her family's ties. The fact that Eleanor, then around 80, could still travel across mountains and negotiate diplomacy speaks to her indomitable spirit. But sorrow weighed heavily upon her. She had outlived many of her children, including her beloved Richard the Lionheart. Her youngest son, King John, proved incapable of ruling with the wisdom and strength of his predecessors. His disputes with barons, his loss of French territories, and his conflicts with the church tarnished the dynasty Eleanor had worked so hard to secure. Yet even John relied on his mother's advice, recognizing that her experience far surpassed his own. In 1204, Eleanor's extraordinary journey finally came to an end. She died at Fontevraud Abbey, where she was laid to rest beside Henry II and Richard. Her tomb effigy, which still survives, depicts her not in mourning but in activity. She is shown reading a book, a final reminder of her intellect and love of learning. It is a fitting symbol for a woman who never allowed herself to be silenced, who defied the conventions of her age at every turn. Eleanor's death marked the close of a chapter in European history. Few women before or since have ruled with such longevity, adaptability, and influence. From heiress to queen of two kingdoms, from prisoner to regent, Eleanor's life encapsulated the turbulence and grandeur of the medieval world. Her final years were not those of decline, but of endurance. Even in old age, she remained a central figure in dynastic politics, shaping alliances that would influence Europe for generations. Her life's arc, from a young duchess in Aquitaine to the matriarch of the Plantagenets, was nothing short of epic. As the bells tolled at Fontevraud, Europe mourned the passing of a queen who had been larger than life. Yet Eleanor's story did not end with her burial. It continued in the legends of her children, in the poetry of troubadours, and in the chronicles of historians who, centuries later, still marvel at the woman who ruled not one but two kingdoms. Eleanor of Aquitaine's legacy is as vast as the lands she once ruled. Few figures in medieval history can rival her influence. She was queen of both France and England, mother of two kings, and the matriarch of a dynasty that shaped Europe for centuries. But her true legacy lies not only in her titles, but in the way she defied expectations and redefined what it meant to be a queen. In a world where women were often sidelined, Eleanor carved out a role of unparalleled authority. She ruled Aquitaine independently, stood as partner to two kings, and acted as regent of England during her son's absence. She defied her husband in rebellion, endured 16 years of imprisonment, and returned to power with unshakable resilience. Her life was a testament to endurance and adaptability. Culturally, she fostered the flowering of the 12th century. By supporting troubadours and poets, she helped shape the ideals of chivalry and courtly love that defined medieval literature. The legends of King Arthur, the songs of knights and ladies, the very image of medieval romance, all bear traces of Eleanor's influence. She was not merely a political actor, but a cultural icon. Her children carried her legacy forward. Richard the Lionheart became the model of the warrior king, while John, though infamous, shaped the events that led to Magna Carta and the evolution of English governance. Through her daughters, Eleanor's bloodline spread across Europe, connecting her to royal houses in France, Castile, and beyond. Even today, many European monarchs trace their lineage back to her. But perhaps Eleanor's greatest legacy is symbolic. She stands as one of the few medieval women remembered not merely as a consort or mother, but as a ruler in her own right. She challenged the gender norms of her time, proving that women could command armies, govern kingdoms, and influence the course of history. Her tomb at Fontevraud still attracts visitors who marvel at the effigy of a queen reading calmly in eternal repose. It is a fitting image of Eleanor, learned, contemplative, yet ever powerful. She was a woman who read, thought, acted, and ruled, a woman who refused to be confined by the expectations of her age. More than 8 centuries after her death, Eleanor of Aquitaine remains a figure of fascination. Historians debate her motives, poets celebrate her spirit, and storytellers return again and again to her remarkable life. She was a queen who ruled not one but two kingdoms, and whose influence stretched across centuries. Eleanor's story reminds us that history is not shaped only by kings and warriors, but by women of vision, courage, and indomitable will. She was, in every sense, a queen for the ages. Eleanor of Aquitaine proved that power is not bound by crowns alone, but by the will to use it. If you enjoyed the story of a queen who ruled 2 kingdoms, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the Crit Stories, where history's most powerful tales come alive.